Hello, my name is Tucker Johnson, and I am your host today as we experience NIMSY Live, where we talk about the latest and greatest in translation, localization, internationalization, culturalization, and all that fun stuff global companies need to delight their international customers, or at least not to piss them off too much. On this program, we invite guests who like to have fun and have some value to add for our audience of globalization professionals. I'm always eager to provide a platform to those with a good story or a good data set, so let us know if there are any topics you'd like covered or guests we should reach out to for future episodes. If you haven't already done so, make sure that you are subscribed or following NIMSY Insights. If you follow us on LinkedIn, you're going to be one of the first people to know when we publish new research at nimsy.com or when we schedule new live streams or host new virtual events on this platform. Speaking of upcoming events, we have a great event tomorrow about investing in the language services industry, and I am actually not going to be hosting that one. That's going to be my colleagues Angelica and Laszlo, who are talking to Marcus from Mayfair Equity Partners, I believe. Forgive me if I got that company wrong, but it's great if you're interested about M&A, financing, exit strategies, any of that stuff that affects our industry here in the localization industry, then make sure to tune into that. Quick introduction to the platform here. We are coming to you live on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. If you are watching us after the live stream, chances are you're on YouTube, where we archive all of our episodes, as well as create podcast versions of those. But if you are here with us on LinkedIn Live, then you can leave comments, use that commenting feature, and we'll bring those up on screen. And any questions, comments, criticisms, we love to have those. So, without further ado, let's introduce today's topic, which, honestly, I am super excited about today's topic because two of my favorite things to geek out about, which are language and the Bible. We're going to be talking about Bible translations. So, quick introduction here. The Translation Insights and Perspectives tool, tips.translation.bible, collects and freely displays data from all languages in the Christian Bible and has been translated to highlight the different ways culture and language have particular and sometimes unique capacities to communicate certain messages in exceptionally enriching ways that other languages cannot. This is relevant to anyone interested in how hyper-multilingualism continuously transforms a text and how translation is a process that fulfills a text rather than loses meaning, a topic which we will surely get into today. My guest today is Jost Zetzsche, returning to the show. You were one of my first victims on the show. Let me give you a quick introduction here. Jost is interested in languages and translation, both in its practical application, as he works as an English to German translator, and writes about how technology can support the translation process. And he's also interested in the aspect beyond that. What impact do languages and translation have on our lives? He also supports translation companies with how to position themselves in the current translation business landscape by helping them to identify what their core strengths are and how to communicate that to potential clients. Jost is the author of A Translator's Toolbox for the 21st Century and Translation Matters, which I've got my copy here. Yes, I'm a fanboy. Jost, Translation Matters, and also what's not interested in here is this lovely coffee table book, Characters with Character, which is a fascinating book. I should have positioned my camera better. That goes through a bunch of characters from languages of lesser diffusion and explains the meanings behind them. I know it's a very personal book for you, Jost, and it was a pleasure for me to read. But today,
and for you to help produce it, right? I mean, you were deeply involved in the process.
we did, and it was published through Multilingual Media, so we had a hand in that process. But Jost, welcome to the show, and of course today we're talking about the tips system here. What I forget, help me explain the subject today.
So let me, I studied history, so I always want to go back a little bit. I had about 8 years ago, 7 years ago, I had an idea that, I've been dealing with translation all my life, and at the same time also dealing with Bible translation. That was the topic of my PhD thesis, and it struck me that we have 3,500 languages translated. The Bible has been translated into 3,500 languages, and we really don't have access to those translations. I mean, we can buy them or read them online, but we don't have access in the sense that we don't understand them. At the same time, I know that languages are unique, have unique ways of expressing text, of expressing what they need to express to their cultural lens. And I thought, wouldn't it be something to have a tool that collects these translations and makes them accessible to a reader, and by that essentially enrich and enlarge the text that they have translated. And of course, the Bible is the by far most translated document or set of documents in the world, and I mean by far, by leaps and bounds. And so I thought this would be really cool to have a database that documents that. I then tried to find supporters, a supporter to help me with that. And it took me a couple of years, but I eventually did find someone in United Bible Societies, which is the umbrella organization for all the regional and national Bible societies. And I have been working with them ever since for six and a half years now or so, and have built this tool with the aid of some programmers, with the aid of a really experienced board of Bible translators. And that's what we're talking about. And we've called it Translation Insights and Perspectives, or TIPS for short. And it's accessible online for free. And we have tried to make it as usable as possible. We, I'm sure, have failed sometimes, but overall, it's very easy to use, very accessible, and the data is ever growing. Just today, I've brought in another 1,000 or so stories that I was able to work on in the last few months, and have now been able to import. And so it's always growing. It's very large. It has 800 some languages right now. It touches on about 3/4 of all Bible verses. It's just really massive. And we have started recently to also add more multimedia data, videos, images that also relate to Bible translation, or our Bible translation. In fact, I think we'll talk about that later. To me, it's I'm a Christian, so I'm interested in the Bible, but I'm also a linguist. And to me, this is, a linguist's dream come true. I'm handling more languages that you and I and everyone else knew were around. I mean,
Right.
We know there's 7,000 languages, but to actually deal with languages that are spoken by sometimes 300 people or 200 people, sometimes 60 or 100 million people, but languages of all sizes, shapes, and forms, is just really, really, really interesting. And I'm trying to communicate my enthusiasm for the topic matter and for the tool, as much as I can to the outside world.
And thank you for that additional context, Jost. It's a really fascinating initiative here, and I want to try to see if I can explain it, and you can correct my misconceptions here in a little bit too. But before we get too far into it, if you are following along at home, there's a great write-up in the May issue of Multilingual, and Jost is a regular contributor to Multilingual. But this one is on page 18. The article is called The Language of Faith, and I've read it several times now. I highly recommend you guys to go check it out. It'll provide some more context to the conversation today, and we're going to try to do it justice here. So for me to just kind of reiterate in layman's terms, essentially what the TIPS, the Translation Insights and Perspectives tool here, and I'm going to bring it up on screen here. Essentially what it is, the Bible's been translated into, and let me pull this other graphic up on screen here. The Bible's been translated into over 3,000 languages, or 3,500 languages. And what did the article say? 800, 900 different variants of English are not even
Isn't that
included.
crazy? There's 900 translations into English, not variant, not different English variations, but just into proper English, there have been 900
It's crazy.
translations of the Bible, which is kind of insane, right? But yeah.
And your thesis, somewhat, or one of your theses in the article, is essentially refuting this trope, as you call it, of lost in translation, right?
Mm.
This is something that laymen, non-linguists like to say, well, something's always lost in translation. And there is some truth to that. Some stuff can be lost in translation, but also stuff can be added during translation, because a true linguist who's really passionate about their work is going above and beyond to add context to make it relevant to the local language speakers and culture. And that is essentially what this database seeks to capture, is what is added in translation. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah, I mean, so like you say, a translation is never a one-to-one scenario, right? You never will capture exactly what it says in any original text in the translation, but you are intending to express the as much as you can the meaning of the text, and by doing that, you will have to add elements also to make it reasonably understandable for any group you're writing for. And languages,
The message comes to mind for
yeah,
my English
sure,
perspective, which
sure, yes,
right.
but so languages are so differently structured, right? Many languages, for instance, just a tiny example, but an interesting example, many languages have an inclusive and exclusive first person plural pronoun, right? So we can mean different things. We can mean me and the speaker and the person right next to it. We can also mean just me and this person right next to it and exclude the speaker. So that sounds really technical, but it has tremendous implications if you have scenes, or if you have text that uses we. A speaker or a writer or a translator in that language will every time have to make a decision which of the we's is actually meant. Now, the Greek text doesn't say that, the Hebrew text doesn't say that, the English, Spanish, French, German text don't say it either. So that speaker has to understand the context of the text that he is translating well enough to know which pronoun he needs to use, right? So that's very technical, but it adds intelligence to the text, actually, because the mental process that translator had to go through, I don't go through as a German or English or Chinese whatever speaker, because I don't have that problem, if you will, or my language doesn't require me to think about it, but I can benefit from somebody else's thinking about it, about this particular issue, and suddenly the text is enriched by me looking at what that person has decided, whether the we actually includes the person in the text that I'm reading, includes the person who is spoken to, or excludes that person. So technical, but interesting, because it adds context, it adds content actually to that particular sentence or segment or phrase, whatever.
Yeah. And now it's all captured for people, lay people who, and when I say lay people, I don't mean lay people in the religious sense, but lay people from the not linguist geeks like us sense, and it's all captured for anybody to go in there and check it out.
Right. Well, I mean, it's still a long process,
yeah, not
right? I
all
mean,
captured.
Right. I mean, so you mentioned that there's 3,500 languages the Bible has been translated into. Right now, we have data from 800 some languages, and there is, this is a project without an end date. This is a project that's going to go on forever and ever. At some point, I'm sure I'm going to hand it over to somebody or to a group of people. But it has a good. We have started well. We have immense amounts of data already, and which is only going to be a small percentage of the data that we eventually will have.
Well, you say project without an end date, and this intersection, language and the Bible, right? It goes back literally to the Bible. And I wanted to get your thoughts on this. You have a great list in here of all these different references to the translation. And, most people, they'll think of, the story of the Tower of Babel, which you don't even mention in
Yeah.
here. And they think of, speaking in tongues, which you do mention in Acts of the Apostles. But kind of, walk us through this. Jesus spoke Aramaic, but they were working out of a Greek Bible, which was translated from the original Hebrew. Um,
Yeah, so I think this is endlessly fascinating, right? So when we deal with the Bible, and in particular with the New Testament, Old Testament to some degree also, but the New Testament in particular, we are dealing with a translated text. So we are, when Jesus is quoted in the New Testament, in the Gospels or in other parts of the New Testament, he is speaking Greek, but he likely was able to understand and speak Greek, but he didn't speak Greek to his apostles or to people that he talked to. He spoke most likely Aramaic. Every time he or someone else in the New Testament is quoting the Hebrew Bible, what we call the Old Testament Christianity, they are actually not quoting from the Hebrew Bible. They're quoting from a translation of the Hebrew Bible, which was widely used at that point in the among Jews, because that was Hebrew had actually fallen out of Hebrew was not a language that was widely used anymore at that point, and the language that was used instead was either Aramaic or Greek. So the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible was the Bible that was quoted by Paul and by Peter and by Jesus in the New Testament. So it's inherently a translated work that we are dealing with the Bible, which is super fascinating, right? Because if that's the case, then it's sort of a nod to translation, that translation is possible.
yeah,
If the Bible, which people take so seriously, some maybe a little bit, too seriously as far as the single word is concerned, but if the Bible is translated itself in the original, well, that gives a real hopeful shout out to translation in general, I think.
right. And the question that comes to my mind is, as Christians will say, the Bible is the infallible Word of God. I don't want to speak for all denominations, right? So, one question I have for you, as a Bible translator yourself, if the Bible is the infallible Word of God, and it's being translated by humans who are, of course, fallible, then how does that get reconciled in Bible translation?
Well, that's a very big question,
I know, not to
obviously.
go too deep into apologetics here.
No.
but,
So there's different ways to understand what actually is to be understood and by the term an infallible word of God. Is it the word by word individual phrases, individual verses, or is it something that we have to view the Bible as a very complex book, a number of books, 66 in the Protestant tradition, that make sense only as a whole, where everything relates to something else? I think that one of the problems that the church has gotten into a lot of trouble with is by picking out individual verses and saying, look what it says here, and look, this is what we need to what we need to see as a truth and as the infallible truth. But in reality, if you look at the context of that verse, or it within the pages it is written in, and even in the greater context within the Bible as a whole, then sometimes you need to understand things maybe a little bit differently and not so much out of context. Of course, Christianity as a whole believes that that the biblical writers, which of course are also humans, it's not that God wrote the Bible,
sure,
nobody
sure.
believes that, were inspired by God to write the Bible, And do we believe that translators are inspired by God? I'm not sure. I think they're praying for
That was
inspiration.
kind of my question, but I didn't want to come right out and ask it. Like, are Bible translators Christian? Do they, like, are there requirements for that? And what are the kind of, I mean, do they have to like take a vow and get anointed with holy water before they open up their Trados studio?
No. And they don't use products, by the way.
Sure, right.
So I think what is happening, I think the best way to summarize what's happening today in Bible translation is Bible translation typically is done by indigenous teams of translators who very often are Christian, who are not always Christian, and they are being equipped with incredibly helpful material to allow them to produce the best possible translations possible. And then they are working very closely with consultants who are, not only preparing the work by working with them on key term lists, et cetera, but also then checking verse by verse the translation that is being produced, even though the consultants often don't speak the language, but by using sophisticated back translations and by a very intense process of discussing the translations typically are being reliable. That doesn't mean that any translation is perfect. No translation is perfect ever, and I think one thing that is really fascinating to me is that if when a church establishes itself in any given language, there's going to be new translations later on. It's not that the one translation that is done at any point in history will be the translation forever and ever, but with increased education, with an increased well-established church, there will be translations that will become better, that will be more idiomatic, that will be more meaningful to the people that translation is being done for. So any translation is always just a starting point, and a very important starting point, of course, but it's never the end product.
Excellent answer. I want to, and I don't have a slide for it, unfortunately, but you cover this very well in your article, so I'm just going to read from it because I think a lot of people, as people that have been reading the Bible their whole lives, they never stopped and think about like how does this translation actually happen. And if you're an English speaker or a German native, then your translation was done hundreds and hundreds of years ago, but new languages are being translated every day. So I'm just going to read from this. We're on page 21 in multilingual here. It's interesting to observe the apparent gap between translation work from the original text into European languages and the current lack of original language scholarship in other native language translation communities. Here's how this is typically solved. So we're talking about specifically here, correct me if I'm wrong, is okay, like ideally the Bible would be translated from Hebrew to the language or from Greek to the language, but that's not always possible with indigenous languages because try finding a Hebrew speaker, right? So here's how this is solved. A translation consultant, well versed in the original languages, whether it be Hebrew, Greek, whatever, meets with the native language team and aids them with things like creating translations of key terms and setting up processes with a very sophisticated translation, research, and publishing tool called Paratext. These consultants can be freelancers, but they're more likely working under the auspices of the Bible societies or organizations like Wycliffe Bible Translators. While the translation team might then continue to work from a set of existing translations in the dominant language, often a colonial language such as English, Spanish, French, or Portuguese, but also languages like Indonesian, Tagalog, Russian, and Chinese, it stays in touch with the consultant until the translation is complete. This translation is then back translated into the dominant language and checked verse by verse against the original text by that same consultant. How do I know that? Says you. because those back translations and paratext form much of the material for a project I have been working on, which is the Translation Insights and Perspective Tips tool here. And I thought that was just really interesting to kind of see how the sausage is made there. And really from, I'm a project manager. I'm a localization project manager. I'm all about efficiency, right? I'm all about my translation memories and reuse and machine translation. And that's not the case. You mentioned jokingly, or half jokingly, but you're serious, that, translators don't use Trados. It sounds to me like just more of a very academic involved process than a translation project that many of us in our industry would know.
Right. It's a very technical process at the same time, though. So there is, the tool. It's so interesting to me. As you know, I'm sort of knowledgeable in the translation technology space in the general translation industry, and it's so interesting to me to see the technology being used by Bible translators, which is completely different, right? They don't use the same tools than we do, but have instead build a tool that is highly sophisticated, but has a very different purpose, and has and by design there is a very manual aspect to working in that really complex technology, because there is this perceived and real need to really check verse by verse by verse. And it's really interesting the discussions then that happen within the framework of paratext, the tool that is being used, are really intense sometimes, really intense, and sometimes controversial, and sometimes going back and forth, and no, we do want to use this term, but is this really and then of course not in English necessarily. So right now I'm working on the documentation for a language called Kwere, which is a Bantu language, and all the discussions are happening in Swahili, of course, because that's the common language then between the translation consultant and the translation team, and very, very lively, and very respectful, but certainly interesting to read, and very rich for me to read, because then that allows me to find out things that the translation consultant or the translator might not even think as being so special and being noteworthy and being data that could be highlighted in my tool. But often I do find really interesting stories in those discussions. Yeah, this is the tool Paratext, and
Yeah.
it's massive. It's gives you access to unlimited amounts of Bible translation data, etc., and of course tools to check against the Greek and Hebrew text. It gives you access to very richly annotated Bible translations in the latter languages, and those latter languages, as you read, are often the colonial languages, and languages of Indonesian is very important. In Indonesia and Papua New Guinea have a huge amount of languages, and Chinese is important, Russian is important, all languages that are the dominant language in areas where there is lots of Bible translation activity.
And you mentioned the back translations from this tool, from Paratext, form the basis of a lot of the work that you were doing. And talk to me a little bit about that. Like, what was that process like when you first started this? Like, what was the first step? Where were you getting the information? How were you structuring it? And how did it evolve and lead to the tips system that you've created today?
Right. So when I first started, I started with published materials. So there are a number of magazines, journals out there that for Bible translators, by Bible translators, and I essentially went through the few decades of their publication and harvested them for information. Lots of books have been written. There's also handbooks that have specifically been written for translators that have many examples that I found useful. And at some point, I, was able to form enough relationships within the translation community that I could then ask people specifically to give me either access to the data or ask questions about specific things that then led to, more access to data. I also have a board that consists of 7 or 8 different translation consultants that are well known in the industry, in the Bible translation world, and they have given me very generous access to all kinds of data. So
Nice.
right now I'm focusing not so much on published data. If there is published data that I haven't seen, of course I will harvest that still, but I'm really more looking at data that is sort of happening often live in translations that are ongoing.
It's ongoing. Like they're taking notes. You got the consultant, you got the native person. They're sending notes back and forth and having conversations, and you're kind of looking over their shoulder, saying,
Sort of. Yeah.
"What insights do you have for me?"
Yeah. I mean, I try to be as respectful of their time.
Sure. Oh, sure.
You imagine they're completely overworked. And so typically a Bible translation consultant doesn't work with one project, but has up to 10 different projects. He works with 10 different languages. And they're completely stretched usually. And depending on the
It's a big book.
It's a big work, I mean,
Yeah.
it's super fascinating work. Now, and these Bible translation consultants often are highly qualified. They all have the PhD, or most of them have the PhD. They, after they get their PhD, especially the ones that work for United Bible Societies, the organization that I work for, go through a between 5 and 10 year apprenticeship program after they get their PhD,
Wow.
before they then become Bible translation consultants in their own right, which makes them very highly qualified and makes them remarkable people. And not only because of that, but I always keep that in the back of my mind as I communicate and talk with them, and know they're not they have important things to do. So my project is important. I do believe it's important. They believe it's important, but still I have to sort of find a common ground there of not being too annoying and too on too much on their case. So that's been a very interesting process. But overall, they have been very generous. And if I have especially specific questions, they have been very, very helpful in giving me the information that I need. So the tool, and that's kind of interesting also, the tool really has 2 different audiences. One audience is translators and Bible translation consultants themselves, who can use can use tips as a reference tool, as a tool to get find information that might inspire them to find their own terminology, etc., etc. That's the one highly specialized audience. The other audience is us, who are just interested in language, maybe interested in the Bible, and who are not specialists, who don't understand. I mean, you and I might understand something about linguistics, but the typical person doesn't. So the challenge for me is to write the information and structure the information that I have in such a way that it's applicable to both. That's not frustrating to the experts who are like, "Oh, what is he talking about? This is so baby stuff." But at the same time, not frustrating to people who I might overtax with too much technical information. So that's an interesting challenge to have that I, constantly am aware of, and I try to, I and my board try to respond to that by constantly negotiating the style of me writing the text, by structuring the information so that without making it too complex to use, some data can be hidden, some data can be displayed depending on who you are and what kind of data you want to use.
Nice. I want to take us back to the article here, because there was this really cool timeline that I don't think is your timeline, but you cited it in here. Let me just pull this up and get rid of this. How do I get rid of this? Sorry, guys. All right, It's hiding behind here somewhere. Here we go. The timeline of periods of Bible translation, right?
Right.
And we talked about this a little bit. It's inherently a translated text from almost day one or day negative numbers based
Mhm.
upon the calendar, right?
Right.
And I was hoping maybe you can just walk us through this quickly. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different phases, and then bring us up to talk about what phase we're in currently.
Sure. So the Bible, like you say, Bible itself is not everything, not everything in the Bible, but at least the New Testament is largely translated, especially the Gospels, which of course form the sort of the basis of Gospels are the accounts of Jesus' life and his ministry. They are translated in the sense that everything that Jesus says is translated, and everything that he quotes from the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible is also from a translation from the Greek version of that Hebrew Bible. The first Bible translations that are happening in about 200 BCE are translations that are done in languages that we don't usually think about, languages like Aramaic, Coptic, the language that was spoken in Egypt, Ethiopic, and Gothic. And the reasons why those translations was because those were the early churches. One of the very earliest churches, that something we don't think about, is, for instance, in Ethiopia. There's that story in Acts, in the book of Acts, where an Ethiopian eunuch is becoming a Christian, is being baptized, and he's going back to Ethiopia. And in fact, that story, or that, possibly that man then actually starts a church in Ethiopia. And so the Ethiopia has earlier churches than anyone else. And they, of course, have an interest to translate. Interestingly, in that case, those translations into GR, which is the language that they use, has now become the language that they now translate into current Ethiopian
Huh.
minority languages. Anyway, the next big point, of course, is the work that Saint Jerome did. The patron saint of translation.
I know that because of your Twitter handle.
I know
That's
Jerome,
that's the
right?
only reason I know who the patron saint of translation is, because of your Twitter handle.
Right. Well, so he is this guy who translates. He's not the first translator of the Bible into Latin, but the one who is clearly the best translator and has a really strong handle both on the language and the Bible. He translates the Bible into Latin, and for the Catholic Church, that translation becomes really important because it becomes the de facto Bible until really 1960 or so, and when or 1950, 53 or something, when the Catholic Church says we can also now translate Bibles from not the Latin version that Jerome translated, but from the Hebrew and Greek text. And then shortly afterwards, a number of other languages, European languages, come up, Dutch, Czech, Armenian, etc., etc. Then, of course, Martin Luther, and shortly before him, the era of printing starts, which allows not hand-copied Bibles, but printed Bibles, which has a huge impact on Bible translation, as you can imagine, and is partly responsible for the Reformation, which then, of course, leads to a Protestant church and the splitting off from the Catholic Church. In the early 1800s, Bible societies are being started in both the US and England, and those Bible societies really push towards translation into languages across the world, especially China and Africa. China in particular, and I know that because that was my academic work, is focus of that effort to translate Bible into Chinese and other languages. And then 150 years later, approximately, a new era starts, which comes with the starting of an organization called Wycliffe Bible Translators and SIL, Summer Institute of Linguistics, which starts sort of training translators usually American or Western translators who go across the world and translate or help translate Bibles into indigenous languages. In the 1960s, then the Vatican II happens. The Catholic convent, or not convent's not the right word. The Catholic agreement that the church needs to be reformed in some way, which leads to interconfessional translations, so translations that Protestant and Catholic and sometimes Orthodox Christians work on together. The lovely thing about the people that I work for, United Bible Societies, we are interconfessional, so we are, doing.
I was going to ask, yeah, but
yeah,
I was
we don't.
curious.
Which is super, which I'm so glad about, and it's also super interesting to work with, Orthodox folks and Catholic folks and Coptic folks, well, they're Orthodox, but all kinds of people with really different approaches to Scripture, but all are valid approaches to Scripture, and it's very, very interesting for me personally and for the project to have not just one strand of faith be represented, but have the whole variety of faiths being represented. And then, in the 1970s, something starts that I find just so interesting and so relevant for today still. Kind of a shift happens from taking the translation away from the white missionary and having indigenous teams work on Bible translation, often with the oversight of a missionary or with a Bible translation consultant who might be not necessarily a white person, who might be from Indonesia or from Russia or from wherever they might be doing translation, and that continues through today. What I find even more interesting, that today we are in a time where this still happens, but something else is also happening. We are kind of moving away from text, from written text. Not that we are, well, I shouldn't say we're moving away from written text. We are including in Bible translation many other forms of translation that are equally valid and often more valid, in fact, for groups that translation is being done for. So that starts with sign language translation. There's 400 some languages, sign language languages around the world. And in many of those languages, most of those languages, some translation work has started. The English Bible, in fact, for the very first time ever, was just published. The complete English Bible has just been published in sign language, in ASL, American Sign Language. Wow. And yeah, it's amazing.
How many hours is that? I'm just curious.
No, a lot of hours, many years that they used to.
No, I mean to watch it.
Oh, I don't know. I'm not sure. A lot.
Sorry, that was. This is the maturity level of my questions.
Well,
so.
I think those are good questions, but yes, I'm working right now. Interestingly, with Russian Sign Language a lot. I'm actually working on a back translation of the Russian Sign Language translation of Luke that I'm going to include into the TIPS project. But aside from sign language translation, there's also an understanding that in some cases, oral Bible translations might be appropriate, either as accompanying, regular text translation, or as maybe being the foremost Bible translation.
Well, there's a lot of indigenous peoples out there that the literacy rate just isn't there. They don't read. And I mean, countries that I've visited, I know I was shocked when I'd find out that they were using the Bible to teach people how to read in their own language, because people didn't even learn their own languages in the schools. They would learn English or the colonial languages. And right. I thought that was really interesting because, I mean, it kind of begs the question, well, why even translate it into that language if they're already reading it in English? And based upon this conversation, I think you've answered that today.
Yeah, I mean, so there, it's it's not an easy question to answer. Typically, what you are trying to do, or what churches are trying to do in anywhere in the world, is to present their members with a translation in a language that they can completely relate to. They might be able to speak the majority language and read the majority language in their and wherever region that they live in, but it might be something that they cannot really connect to and cannot truly understand in a way that you and I can understand, in the languages that we are really familiar with. And so it's often a long process of finding out what the need for a specific group really is. Is it really important to translate the Bible into a group of 200 people, maybe, who speak a certain language, a language that might be dying out? Hard to say, but often that is the case, unfortunately. So what the churches are trying to do is to be wise into making decisions to see whether a Bible needs to be translated in any given language. And sometimes those decisions have gone awry. I've just recently started to document a little bit from a Bible in Liberia that has never been touched, was completely translated, New and Old Testament, 20-year process, but by the time the Bible was done, the language had died, essentially. So immense work had gone into translating that language, but it was for naught, because nobody speaks that language anymore actively. Youngsters didn't have an interest. They prefer to learn English in Liberia, and that version is useless. And there are a number of examples like that. But overall, churches are trying to make wise decisions on what to translate, and that's what they're doing then.
I want to, and thank you for adding that additional concept. You're right. It's not an easy question to answer, right? And I'm sure you know Tim Brooks, right? A fellow regular columnist. I'm not sure if I'm speaking to him this month, but he's come on the podcast before. He does a lot of work keeping languages alive. If you're listening, go check out the work that the Endangered Alphabet Project is doing. I think there's a lot of overlap here. I wanted to go over to the tips system, and I keep calling it tips
because it's good. I mean, that's what we want people to call.
Okay, good. So I don't have to say translation, insights, and perspective. And I want to kind of do a live demo here, because I haven't used this before. Do we have a verse that you'd like?
Yeah, go to Mark 11:25. I think that's right.
Mark 11:25.
Let's see whether that's right.
So let's see what we got here.
Yeah, that's a nice example. So
whenever you stand praying, forgive if you have anything against anyone, so that your Father in heaven may also forgive you your trespasses. Is Mark 25 for our podcast listeners who can't see the screen.
So you can see that there's the Greek original text on the left-hand side, followed by a English reference text. Doesn't matter from what version, it's just a reference text. And then you have on the right-hand side about 15 or 20 different, we call them stories sometimes, or insights, that all relate to that particular text. So every one of those words you see here, or phrases, are actually phrases from that text. And you can see that sometimes it is interesting little insights, and sometimes they are also terms like the one that's coming up here, forgive and forgiveness, that have massive amounts of data. You have 20 or 30 different languages, all of which have tried or have translated the concept of forgiveness, difficult concept to understand for anyone. And
culturally dependent too, right?
Exactly. And if you go up again a little bit, Tucker, and if you click on that, the view graphically thing here, then you see that we also have done a graphic representation of these terms that have lots and lots of data. So you can see it more easily, and you can you don't have all the detailed data there, but you get an idea of what we're talking about here. And then if you scroll down on that screen a little bit, you go to the horizontal little button that you have there and choose radial, and then you can see that even in a fancier layout there. Pretty cool, huh?
This is freaking sweet.
I know, and it's even dynamic. So it once these.
It's a database. It's a
database.
live database, right? So you're adding to it, and those changes are being added in real time,
immediately being displayed. Yeah, so it's really cool. I mean, there's a like I said, I do have a team of programmers. I used to have just one. Now I have a team that are really good, and that are, if I have an idea what we could do, usually are able to put that into practice really quickly. There are downsides to the tool. I don't want to just say how wonderful it is when there are some problems. One problem is, so it's this hyper-multilingual tool, 800 some languages in one language. So we have not really found a smart way of making this multilingual for end users. We are talking about 800 languages and documenting 800 some languages, and will be 900 soon and more than that. But it's only done in English, and which is a real heartache for me and the team that I'm working with. The data is so massive at this point. It's really, really large, that it becomes unreasonable to manually translate, and it also becomes unreasonable, or is unreasonable, to machine translate it, because it's the nuances that are really.
It's literally about the nuances.
That's exactly right. And as you and I know, machine translation is not going to capture that well. And so this is a problem that we have been staring at for years, literally years now. And there are some ideas how to fix some of it, but we'll see. We'll see how we go about it. The other thing that I sometimes wish would be different. So users can search data in a number of ways. You can search data by verse, like you did just now. So you can say, I'm reading a certain verse in the Bible. I want to see what other languages have to say about that. And you can also search data by term. So you can enter any term you want, whatever, and you will get everything that has to do with, father, whether it appears in the text of the little story or in the heading, and you can find information about that. And that's all good. And you can also search by category. So if you pick the category, there's all kinds of different categories that we kind of made up that specify what kind of data you can find. And we did that as an aid to help, but we also did that for new users of the website, so that they can get an idea of what to expect from this tool. So one problem it's not a problem, one thing that we have, I'm entering data into the tool, and because the Bible is so large, and because the data is so vast that I have in the tool, it sometimes virtually disappears. Somebody can find it, of course, if he or she specifically looks for it, or specifically stumbles on the verse that this data might refer to. But it's sometimes I have this amazing, interesting data, and I know that it might be a year and a half before somebody finds that again. So that's what we have.
It's a user experience problem, essentially.
It kind of is, and we are, of course, grateful for any kind of suggestion on how we can make that easier to find, or how we can do that better. But yeah.
Well, so that's very very humble of you to go through that. I think the tool's amazing for what it is, especially considering this is put together. You guys aren't becoming millionaires off of the back of this. You can tell this is a work of passion, right? No, yeah, this is a work of passion. It's a work to help people. It's a work to leverage cross-cultural knowledge. All of these things that I personally am passionate about. Obviously not as passionate as you to actually go out and put my money where my mouth is, but hey, I'll host you on a podcast so you can talk about it. And that's my contribution. As we're coming up on the hour here, I wanted to bring up this quote here from an article. Like I said, you've been reading or you've been contributing to Multilingual and other publications and running your own blog for years and years and years and years. And you said this 10 years ago in a 2013 article. Jost, ended with this. Here's my dream as a faithful translator sitting in the pew. The next time my pastor expounds on the broader meaning of a biblical term, that foreign-sounding word he draws from may not be Greek, Hebrew, or Aramaic, but Quechua or Navajo or Korean or any of the more than 3,000 other possibilities. Sometimes dreams work out just fine. And that's what I mean. I expect to see this in the PowerPoint presentation during the sermons coming, because it's a really cool tool. And every once in a while the sermons say, well, here's what the Hebrew blah blah blah, and they go into a
Oh,
diatribe about that. I mean, that's a common occurrence.
exactly.
But how
And it's
much
kind of,
cooler if they could bring 5 other languages into it.
that's right. And here, and not only 5 other languages, but from a source that the people who listen to the pastor can easily access and look at them up themselves. One of my great, obviously I'm interested in languages. I mean, that's you and I are about languages, right? And so there is a certain interest that I have when a pastor or my pastor talks about the Greek or Hebrew origin of a certain term. But what really bothers me about that is what the pastor is actually saying, kind of, is, folks, you don't really understand the Bible. Let me explain what the real meaning of the Bible is by explaining to you what the Greek or Hebrew actually means, not what you find in your translation. I know the real meaning of. And I think
Wasn't there some sort of reformation to settle this topic?
that's exactly. It's like pre-Reformation stuff. It's
right?
like, it drives me crazy. It drives me. It just, it essentially says, I have the key to the kingdom, and you follow me and you listen to me when I explain this text to you. And that bugs me. Has always bugged me. And I just think
but now you, the linguist, are the ones with the key to the kingdom.
Well, now I'm making it more democratic. Now I'm saying, you can go out just as the pastor has gone out to my tool. You can all go out to my tool and read that information, rather than having it, in the theological degree that your pastor might or might not have. And so that's one thing that I feel sort of passionate about, very passionate about, actually. And I'm looking forward to this being more used in churches. I mean, that's part of what I'm doing now, is that I'm working on continuing my work on the tool to make it better and make it more comprehensive. But I'm also writing a lot and publishing a lot about the tool in Christian magazines or journals, and on podcasts and whatever, and including this year, of course, to make the tool more known and more widely used. It's a phenomenal tool. I think anyone who looks at it will have to kind of say that, because it is phenomenal. It's not me who made it phenomenal. It's the data that's so phenomenal. And I want it to be used by every single person who is interested in the Bible, by every single person who is interested in language, and clearly by pastors also who wrestle with a biblical text, or should wrestle with a biblical text every week for a sermon or for other stuff. And they should be able, or should want to, look at how other languages are confronting the text, and especially, and I hate to kind of say it like that, especially in the US, where sometimes there is not maybe the greatest appreciation what other languages aside from English, or in this case,
It's
Hebrew,
born out of ignorance. Let me speak for my people, right? Us Americans, like we're ignorant, and I don't mean that in a malicious way. I mean that just in a matter-of-fact way. We're ignorant about other languages because we're not exposed to them, right? I think there is a thirst for this in the American pews. Why do I know
Yeah.
that? Because it is not an uncommon occurrence, for example, that my pastor will bring up 5 different translations of a verse. However, one's from New King James, one's from
Mhm.
the New International Version,
Mhm.
one's from the American Standard Version. You know what I'm
Right.
saying? So there
Mhm.
is a thirst for this to provide additional context and, be a better shepherd, whatever metaphor you want to use, right? And it's just we're ignorant here in America
Yeah.
about
Mhm.
the existence of other languages.
Yeah. Mhm. Here, let me show you. Let me tell you one example that I actually just added last week, and it took me almost a year to have that person who gave me that example give me that example because it was all complicated and whatnot. This is a language. In Brazil. It's called Marubo, spoken by 1,500 people, and they have a super complex system of past tense. They have the past tense of today, the past tense of yesterday, and I think 2 weeks ago, then the past tense of 2 weeks ago and several years ago, then the past tense of your childhood, and then the past tense of anything that might have happened before you were alive. And the verse that person dealt with was at one point. Jesus heals this blind person by smearing mud on his eyes, and he does it on a Sabbath, which was not allowed according to the Jewish religious authorities. And they confront the man and say, "What did this preacher do to you?" And he says, the man answers, "He put mud on my eyes." And "he put mud on my eyes" was really complex to translate for that for that translation team, because did they actually interview him on the Sabbath also? In that case, it needs to be the form of the past tense that includes today, right? Did they interview him maybe a day or 2 or 3 or 4 after it? In that case, it needs to be a different form of past tense. So what's interesting about it is that these people had to look at that simple verse. So easy, right? "He put mud on my eyes," and had to go into a week-long discussion about what that let's see here. Go to it's I think a
9:11, it should
is
be.
it,
No.
wait.
He answered, "The man called Jesus made mud, spread it on my eyes, and said to me." Then I
Let's
went
go to 9:10. Maybe it's a 9:10.
9:10, but they kept asking.
No, let me pull that up here on my side so I can tell you exactly where it
Sure.
is.
No, I was just chuckling because like my pastor literally preached on that 2 Sundays ago.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's top
I'll
of my
go to 9:15. It's 9:15.
9:15. All right. We'll speed over there. John 9:15. All right. Then the Pharisees also began to ask him how he had received his sight. He said to them, "He put mud on my eyes. Then I washed, and now I see." I don't see it. So washed, past tense. He put, past tense, and then I
Uh-huh.
washed, past
Exactly.
tense, right?
But which
But
past
no
tense is it?
context. No context for me as an English
No
speaker.
context. So these actually this the person that I got to know the person because he started a discussion on a discussion list specifically for translators, and it went on for days and weeks, and he finally then decided to use he made a decision that the Pharisees actually interviewed him that very same day. Is that really important? Not really, but kind of. You know what I'm saying? There's just a little bit of additional information in that particular piece of text that you didn't have before. And the information is that someone spent a lot of time to think that through and come to a decision that this is what it was. And
now that's captured.
And now it's captured. And that's interesting for me and interesting for the church, interesting for anyone. You know, we had no idea before this was captured that this tiny language has this complex system of past tenses. Now we know, and that's interesting. And that's what I'm doing.
Well, very cool. Any other last minute? I'm watching the clock here. We're already over time. I told you that was going to happen once we get to chatting. Anything else we want to cover?
Oh, I should probably say I've recently started to put a lot of art and into the tool. And you can, your listeners can go to the website and just choose the category art, or I think it's called whatever
In
it's
the
called.
tips tool?
In the tips tool. And that's been a lot of fun for me to do. I've chosen art and also icons, a lot of icons I've chosen that I put it into context. You can see down here a few examples. Art that is sort of that helps you to meditate on maybe some of the verses rather than giving you a super clear image of what this is about. So this is, or
It wasn't enough to stop with 3,000 languages. This
no,
you had to go into multimedia as well.
I did.
You are nothing if not ambitious.
Okay, so here is something really cool. Don't do that right now because it's going to not transfer well on our with the sound here. But I have a number of videos from Southern Altai throat singing.
Oh, I can do video. I can do audio with my setup.
It's super cool. So here is these several verses and the several parts of the Bible. The whole book of Jonah, for instance, is done with the Southern Altai throat singing. It's a throat singing like we know from the Siberian throat singing. It's very similar to that. And here's the amazing story. So this is not only back translated for me, so I can use it. I would never use this if it's not made applicable to my. I don't do stuff that is just exotic. I do stuff that is helpful to readers, right? I would have never used these videos if they just sound fancy. It's interesting because it's also back translated, but the story behind it is so great because it's Southern Altai, is a small language in Far East Russia, and it's a language that where the throat singing had completely gone out of fashion until recently, where throat singing had this renaissance. People listen to this, according to the woman I have talked to, who has given me access to those, and these songs with the text of, in this case, Psalm 23, have such an impact on the people who listen to it, much more potentially than the written word that's also available. And I think that's amazing, right? So here's this guy who
That's super cool. I'm not going to do all 2 minutes of it. People can go check it out themselves.
My wife she thought it was interesting, but I've actually played it at home a lot, and she was not too happy about me.
I was going to say, yeah, it's like giving your kid a drum set.
I know. But I this stoic man who is has helped to revive this old form of song in this culture that has this renaissance right now, and people are, to us, to you and me, we listen to it and go like, are there actually words in there? We can't really hear words, but they can.
Sounds like my garbage disposal needs fixed.
Kind of.
No blasphemy, no disrespect, right? But to my ignorant American ears.
So this is stuff I'm very excited to find also, and I'm really encouraging, folks to give me access to stuff like that so I can include that as well, because I know this is interesting for my audience, for the user of this tool, to not have it all just in text, but to communicate, like we said earlier, that the Bible is not only being translated into text, into written text. The Bible is being translated into all kinds of forms, whether it's storytelling, whether it's song, whether it's dance, whether it's art, or sign language, all kinds of ways that the Bible is being translated. And we can learn from all of them. We might just be glued to our Bible on our desk or whatever, but we can also enlarge a view of this interesting text by looking at so many other things, and that's what I'm trying to present as much as I possibly can.
Well, thank you, sir. You are literally doing God's work, and I thank you for your effort, and thank you for coming on the show today. Coming back on the show, you were one of my first victims, as I said, who came on my podcast, so I appreciate that. Multilingual.com, guys, is where you can find out more about Multilingual Magazine, and I say that because Jost is a frequent contributor, submitting articles. Do you run a column, or do you just submit a lot of articles?
Oh, I'm on the board actually for.
Well, I should mention that too, right?
And so I just over the years I've written a number of articles for them.
Yeah, I'm the guy they call when they need to fill out 4 pages, and the print deadline's in 3 days. So, I got an article in the next issue. Well, Jost, thank you so much, like I said, for coming on the show. Everybody, go follow Jost on social media. Twitter, Jeromobot is famously his Twitter handle. And I'm going to take us out here. Ladies, gentlemen, I appreciate our guest today, Jost Zetzsche. I appreciate my colleagues here at NIMSY Insights doing all that hard work so I can have these fun conversations. I appreciate everyone in our industry who fills out NIMSY surveys and schedules briefings with our analysts so that we can include you in our published industry research. And finally, I appreciate you, the audience, who are joining us live today, all of the dialogue and chat, and everyone that's going to go follow NIMSY Insights and follow Jost after this. And with that, I'll say I look forward to next time. Cheers.
Thanks, Tucker.